Hello, welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. I'm in the London Borough of Barnet today, right at one of the northern extremes of the Northern Line. I'm going to be visiting two areas, both Whetstone and High Barnet. Both of these were formerly independent settlements along the Great North Road here. This was an ancient coaching route and droving route that led out of London to the north of England and on from there to Scotland. We're going to be looking at some former coaching inns and posting houses today, some which have hopefully retained at least a bit of their old world charm, others which have probably fared less well, and others still which have sadly not survived into the modern age. Pub number one, the Griffin in Whetstone. Cheers from the Griffin in Whetstone. Absolutely sprawling, vast garden, and this of course is a clue that this is a one-time coaching inn. Let's take a look at the exterior first. The building we're looking at today is a rebuild of around about 1930 in a style I suppose you could broadly call mock Tudor. It has quite an unusual mixture of stone cladding on the frontage, and there is an organisation of geologists called the London Geodiversity Partnership who have published an article that details some of the different types of stone used here. I'll put a link to that in the description. There's at least a dozen different types of stone here. The gargoyle-esque faces on the corbels are also interesting. They're sort of grotesquely comical. I wonder, are they possibly supposed to be griffin faces? To the right-hand side is an archway with a large door, which is a common trope of a former coaching inn. This is on camera's list of historic pub interiors. It's just a 1-star rating, so there isn't perhaps a huge amount of original fabric. Perhaps two of the most striking features are these large mock Tudor fireplaces with Tudor arches. There's one on the left which is perhaps slightly grander, and also one on the right in a similar style. Camera's notes suggest that the bar counter is likely interwar. It has rounded corners. At the back of the pub is also quite an atmospheric room with a lot of panelling and some doors with more of those Tudor arches, and that has quite an impressive skylight up above it. Suggests something possibly like a billiards room at one time. Let's take a look at the history of the Griffin. According to the Barnet Local History Society, the earliest reference to the Griffin was in 1679. Here's Whetstone on John Rock's map of Middlesex of 1754. There isn't a huge amount of detail here, but you can see the Great North Road passing through with the 10th milestone to the north of the village, and the pub would have been situated by the crossroads here. In front of the pub is a lump of rock, which it is suggested Whetstone takes its name from. This is of course reminiscent of the Wheelstone that we covered in a video a few months back. The legend goes that soldiers on their way to the Battle of Barnet in 1471 stopped by here to sharpen their swords on this particular Whetstone. That was a decisive conflict in the War of the Roses and a victory for the House of York, pivotal in putting Edward IV on the throne. However, unfortunately, this story for the origin of the name Whetstone is likely untrue. There are written records of similar names for this area being used prior to the Battle of Barnet in 1471, and it more likely derives from something like West Town. The Barnet Local History Society instead believes that this lump of rock is a remnant of the tollgate, the entrance to the turnpike road from here to Highgate, and this would have been something like a mounting block. You can see the stone at the foot of the pub sign in this photo from sometime around 1900, and the pub is over to the right. The pub is marked as inn on this OS map of around 1914. This is slightly unusual. I haven't seen this on these old Ordnance Survey maps before. It's usually a PH for public house or perhaps sometimes hotel. Today, the pub is apparently operated by the Dallas Pub Company, not one I've heard of before, possibly just a small pub company. They were obviously having a bit of a difficult day with the hand pumps. They had Oakham's Citra was the only one actually on the hand pumps, and I'm guessing that is made with Citra hops, as the name suggests. So I gave that a wide berth. Even the Guinness on the keg taps was off. They weren't having a very good day. So I instead settled for a half of inches, which comes in this, I think, rather cute little glass. Pub number two, and it's the first of a few dead ones we're going to be looking at today. This is the Green Man, now Green Man Tyre and Exhaust Limited. This was last rebuilt in 1890, as it says up there in that almost Dutch gable at the top of the building. It's predominantly in stock brick, but some of the pillars and other detailing are in red brick. A newspaper article of 1831 shows that at that time this was a relatively prominent coaching inn, or perhaps more accurately a posting house. This was, according to that article, the point on the Great North Road where all of those mail coaches would stop to change their horses. You can see the pub named on this 1860s Ordnance Survey map, and note that the Griffin, which is only a few doors down from here, was not named on the map at that time, although we believe it would have existed then. Here is a charming advert for the pub of around 1900, which also mentions its proximity to the Whetstone and that the pub offers all the attractions of an old wayside inn. I think it ceased to be a pub at some time in the 1920s, and by the time of this newspaper article of 1927, it was already being referred to as the Green Man Garage. So it has a history of about 100 years now of being a place for car servicing, and I suppose in a way you could say there is a strange sense of continuity from its days of changing horses for the mail coaches going along the Great Northern Road to its current incarnation, if this is still a going business, of changing car tyres and exhausts. Although I get the sense from the internet that even Green Man Tyres and Exhausts has now also gone out of business. Moving on up the hill now to High Barnet, and it really is the end of the line. You can see that quite dramatically here. It's a place with a little bit of an identity crisis, High Barnet. It's also known as Chipping Barnet. Chipping is of course a prefix that gets added to many town names to mean a town that has a market, and I think that probably attests to the Barnet Fair Charter that was granted in 1588 by Queen Elizabeth I that allowed both a weekly market and a twice annually fair. It still exists in some form. I think it's gone down to just being once a year now. Pub number 3, having to shout over the strimmers over there, the Red Lion in High Barnet. Cheers from the Red Lion. This is in fact a listed building, so we have some notes from Historic England on the exterior. Coincidentally, this is another pub that was rebuilt around 1930. Overall, it's in a neo-Georgian style, which seemed to be one of only 2 options available in that interwar period for pub design. It was either neo-Georgian or mock Tudor. I think 2 features about this pub particularly stand out to me. One is the scallop-headed door case as you enter on that corner entrance, and the other is this wrought iron bracket that really sticks out into the street with a large, possibly plaster, I'm not sure what it's made of, Red Lion on top of it. And apparently that was actually transplanted from the previous building, so that is a relic of an earlier version of this pub. That aside, it's looking a little bit rough around the edges, if I'm honest. A lot of peeling plasterwork and possibly in need of a little bit of attention, I think. I could just about believe this bar counter and bar back is from the 1930s. It's certainly stylistically a little bit like that. At one end there is a rounded corner and the bar actually slopes inwards slightly. It's mostly matchboard panelling. There's some, I suppose, reasonably nice carving in this arcade with Corinthian columns in the bar back. That aside, it is mostly a modern interior, and in fact most of this pub is now given over to dining. It's something like the reincarnation of the era of, is it Burney Inns? I don't think they exist anymore. I think it was formerly a Toby Carvery, and now it's some other kind of similar kind of concept, possibly more based around pizza or something. But there is still at least one corner of the pub that operates as a pub. So this is another former coaching inn or possibly posting house. With some claims it may go all the way back to the 15th century. It's possibly mentioned by Pepys in his diary in 1667, although there is some confusion here over which Red Lion he's talking about here. There was until quite recently another Red Lion down at the bottom of Barnet Hill that I think survived until about 2015. It was called the Old Red Lion, and he may have been talking about that one instead. At least a Red Lion gets a mention in Carey's new itinerary of 1798, and I think this is in fact describing the route of the Great North Road as it heads into or out of London. It seems to have been referred to as the Red Lion Hotel from at least 1851 right up until the time of this 1960s Ordnance Survey map. All of the hand pumps looked very inactive. They had some leaflets, a rack of leaflets or something put in front of them. So they've obviously not been used for quite a long time. So I just went for a half of Guinness from the keg taps. Pub number 4, the Bull. Long since closed. I think that ceased to be a pub in around about the 1960s. Now a theatre, and a theatre school in fact. I think it counts Amy Winehouse in amongst its alumni. Some records suggest it may have gone as far back as the 1400s, and once again a former coaching inn. You can probably just about see a gate off to one side there, and that would have led at one time to a stable yard and so forth. Here is an article I found about it from 1718, at which time the landlord had apparently been shot by a highwayman. Pub number 5, again another closed one, sorry, but this is the Crown and Anchor behind me, a beautiful bit of mock Tudor. Once again, this is an interwar reconstruction. There seem to be so many of them. It was possibly the work of Arthur Edward Sewell, who we've encountered many times before in these pub videos, the chief architect for Truman's. Very likely yet another former coaching inn. You can possibly see off to one side the alleyway which would have led through to the stable yard. It has a lovely run of carved corbels in between the ground and first floor, and they have comical faces, a little bit reminiscent of those grotesque faces we saw at the Griffin. And in between those there's some plasterwork that I suspect is possibly a riff on the home nations. You can just about see a thistle there and possibly 2 different versions of roses. Is that maybe the Lancashire rose and the Yorkshire rose? I can't quite remember. And I wonder if that might have been a tip of the hat to the Battle of Barnet. Today it's something like an accountant's on the upper floors and an Italian restaurant on the ground floor. Pub number 6, the Old Mitre Inne. Cheers from the Mitre in Barnet. This is both a listed building and it's on CAMRA's list of historic pub interiors. So this is without a doubt going to be the gem of today's pub tour. Historic England's listing is relatively short, but it does say that the building is likely 17th century. It's timber framed, it was refronted in the 19th century, double bay window and good etched glass. I think some of the etched glass that we see today on the outside there is more modern, the stuff that is immediately facing the street. But if you look slightly beyond those perhaps slightly more modern windows, there are other elements of what I believe to be original, or at least original from the 19th century etched glass. CAMRA's notes say that the bar counters are likely Victorian. The one that I first encountered there has this lovely row of stained glass over the top of it as well, with the name of the pub. Beneath that there is an impressive array of hand pumps. Did I count at least 8 there, I think? It's a couple of nice seating areas near the front, in amongst those bay windows. There is a probably Victorian fireplace here, and part of the bar counter follows a line along from there. There's somewhat exposed beams in the walls there. I'm not sure how original that feature is. Has a nice Christmas tree on my current visit. I like these bar stool and miniature table drink shelf configurations, and then a corridor from there leads towards the back of the pub, presumably an old pub sign installed in there. And then there's this area which was converted from the original stable block, and you get a very strong sense of that with these low doors with the bars in them. I think one of those actually still works, and horse brasses on the wall and a saddle on the other wall. A very strong sense of its former use as a stable. And as that suggests, this is of course yet again another former coaching inn. A mitre is of course a bishop's hat, and there is a suggestion that this was perhaps a pub that was used by the clergy. We are immediately opposite Barnet Church here. Is that dedicated to St John the Baptist? The pub frontage states that it was established in 1636. I found a written mention going back at least as far as 1730 in an historical list of all horse matches run, and the proprietor, I believe, of the Mitre at that time is given in the list of subscribers at the back of that book. So this is clearly a pub with a strong connection to horses. In its heyday, it was claimed that it had stabling for over 100 horses. One of the pub's legends is that a bet was made at Barnet Fair that a man could ride a horse up Barnet Hill, which this pub is at the top of, backwards. The rider in fact died trying, having been knocked off his horse by the pub sign, and presumably, like we saw at the Red Lion at one time, this would have had a sign that projected further out in the street. Dictionary author Samuel Johnson called in with his friend Mrs. Thrale in 1774. I believe it was a brief visit, but there is a written account of that in Mrs. Thrale's diary. They carried us to the Mitre at Barnet, a house kept by Lady Lade's maid. The Lady Lade mentioned here was a prolific horse rider and became a favourite of the Prince Regent at the time, later George IV, who had a portrait of her commissioned. I think part of the reason he was so fond of her is because of her overwhelming use of profanity. You may be aware of the modern phrase for somebody who is a bit potty-mouthed, that they swear like a trooper. Well, back in that period of history, it was apparently quite common to say that somebody swears like Lady Lade. It's a Green King pub today, although honestly it feels like a completely independent free house sort of pub. The beer selection was really quite impressive. It was at 8-9 hand pumps on the bar. Given that we're in the run up to Christmas, I decided to go with a kind of seasonal ale, and this is, I forget the name of the brewery, but this is a gingerbread mild, which does taste incredibly strongly of gingerbread. Not sure if this is something I want to drink a lot of, but as a one-off that's been really interesting. Pub number 7, and this is unfortunately temporarily closed while they look for new management, the King's Head. Hopefully this pub will reopen at some point in the new year, I think when they found some new management to run it. It's a McMullen's pub today. I would say it looks broadly Victorian to me. I couldn't find any specific date for the current building. Possibly another coaching inn. Again, you can see there is a sort of alleyway to one side with a gate in front of it. Locally, the King's Head has the nickname the Glass House, and it was apparently the first pub in the area to start using glasses to serve beer in rather than the more traditional pewter tankards. I think that transition from pewter and possibly ceramic drinking vessels to pint glasses in pubs probably started in around about the 1880s. The earliest mentions that I could find of pint glasses in the newspapers come from around that time, the 1880s. Here's one from 1888, by the time of Orwell's essay of 1946, describing his ideal but fictitious pub, the Moon Underwater. There is a sense that pewter tankards were a relic of a former age, not really in common use anymore. For some time, the King's Head here was owned by the wonderfully named Clutterbuck & Co. brewery. I think they were based in Harrow, and then sometime in the late 19th century, it was taken over by McMullen's, who still own the site today. Pub number 8, the Black Horse. Cheers from the Black Horse. I think there is in fact a wake going on here, so I'm not going to do any interior shots. I think that would be a bit disrespectful, and I'm trying to keep as far away from the pub as possible to give everyone their space. I wanted to include this one because at one time this pub had its own brewery on site. Alas, I don't think that's any longer the case, so I've just gone for a half of Timothy Taylor's Landlord. I haven't done my research on this particular pub. I'm just sort of tacking it on the end because by the time we'd seen 4 different pubs that were closed today, I knew 3 of them were going to be. One wasn't quite sure either way. I felt it was a little bit short shrift to only have included 3 pubs that were actually still open. I think we're by this point a little bit off the Great North Road, so possibly this was not originally a coaching inn like all of the others that we've seen today. Without a doubt, the standout pub for me is the Old Mitre, and that's definitely one that I would be going back to. So thanks very much for watching. I hope that's been of some interest. Cheers, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye bye.